Awesome. And I believe we are live, Joe. I just hit the big red button on StreamYard. We've got this beautiful comment from Supreme Penny Pincher. Not sure who this person is, but they just said, "What's cracking?" It's Sheeran or not sure how to pronounce it. It says, "Hello, hello, welcome." It looks like we've got 15 or so folks here joining in today on this is an IT support group and IT MSP entrepreneurs. My name is Stetson Blake, joined here today by Joe Furla or Joseph Furla, who is a head nerd at Enable. Specifically, I don't want to say specifically, but we'll be talking about Apple management today. Joe, would you like to give a brief intro to who you are and what you're up to?
Like Stenson mentioned, I am the Mac head nerd here at Enable, um, working both in N Central and Insight, our RMM platforms. And then, of course, that also bleeds over into security and backup and recovery tools and, the whole gambit of the world. Um, so, looking at where I tend to sit in the Mac world, most often tends to actually be the automation side of the house. Because there's a couple tools out there that have made managing Macs pretty easy, at least for beginners. So
Yeah, that's
if you
all we're chatting about today too. I
yeah.
wanted to introduce you as head nerd on Mac site, but I wasn't sure if that was if you wanted to be bucketed there or not.
Um, yeah, so the running joke on the head nerd team at Enable, if you're familiar with us, is I'm the proxy nerd. So I am Insight, Mac, operational efficiency, cloud commander, MSP manager, MailerShare, take control, analytics, backup security, backup sales and marketing, and then central nerds. So I'm
So you
really
don't
just
do much work there then, right?
not at all,
You got a pretty lax week, I imagine.
right?
Awesome. Well, Joe, we should get to it. Our title today is what is it? I forget myself. How to
I
manage Apple devices, and then I put in parentheses for beginners. So maybe we could start to chat about that ecosystem a little bit. But I guess before that, even I'm kind of curious: is this both iPhones and MacBooks? What types of devices will we cover and chat about today?
so I think if you look at least from a tools perspective, the folks that are in the space for MSPs, where you've got, of course, the RMM players like Kaseya, ConnectWise, Datto RMM. You've got us and Insight and Central, but then you get into the truly Mac specific world with Adigy and Jamf. Um, the monitoring is there for everything: iOS, tvOS, iPadOS, macOS, right? And then you get MDM or mobile device management for those operating systems as well. And then in most of the tools, you'll see the iOS and iPad and tvOSs primarily go for monitoring. It's the Mac OS where you see these tools function more in a true management world.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for covering that. I guess I didn't even think about like monitoring tvOS and some of these different devices, but totally makes sense that be bucketed in there, right?
Right. Yeah. And if there's an MSP out there who's managing tvOS devices, let me know and I'll send you my condolences. Um,
There you go. Yeah, yeah, same here. Same goes for me. Well, cool. I think we should, perhaps start chatting on the mobile side.
yeah.
There's lots of MDM tools. Kind of curious. You fired off a bunch on what was it, Datto, Kaseya,
hmm
ConnectWise, a few different ones. Maybe we could cover MDM, and then I think we should chat about this thing called ABM.
Yeah. So your primary avenue for management of Mac devices for a lot of the basics is going to be through a mobile device management tool. Apple has their own, right, which you can use. Um, but you'll see more often than not MSPs looking at using the MDM that's built into their RMM tool. And the ones I have most familiarity with are going to be Adigy, Jamf, which are going to be the biggest players in the market. Adigy's been around for 25 years. Jamf, I think, is pushing 30. And then, of course, device management for Apple in Enable, right? Just because that's where my experience lies. But what that MDM tool is designed to allow you to do is control profiles or configurations on the device through mobile config files. So we think of that as anything underneath the system settings. If I want to set up and lock a screensaver or set up and lock a background on a desktop, right? We could do that through mobile config files through some type of profile management inside mobile device management. But then you also get to the serious stuff, right? Full disk access for your RMM tools, your take control tools, and the like. And typically, those kind of leading into ABM, those MDM tools are either going to allow you to register your Mac devices in a one off using what's called a push certificate. So, your Apple ID, right? Or your end user's Apple ID, however you would like to be managing them. I tend to say Apple ID per client as that primary admin ID can create a PEM file or a push certification. And you'll load that into the MDM and that'll register your standalone devices, right? The onesie twosies that we're looking at managing. And that'll
Yeah.
give you not only that profile management, but it'll also start to through these MDMs give you the ability to firmware lock a device if it's stolen, restart the devices on command, remote wipe if it's stolen, update device information, shut down, the device remotely and that type of deal. But most importantly as well, these MDMs are going to allow you to remotely update the Mac OS. And that's a big thing because it is very difficult to script the remote update of a Mac device because the command pumped through the terminal to update a Mac device remotely has a solid chance of bricking the device, and nobody wants a $2,500 Apple labeled brick on their table. Um,
No, I think not.
but where these MDM tools can make some of this enrollment, which can be a problem because it requires end user interaction, right, to confirm that the device can be managed, sometimes to even push out the software itself, because Apple is as Apple does. You can get Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager. And what that tool will allow you to do is enroll your devices into that business manager, which will give you access to the volume purchaser program for application management, but it'll also allow you to set a mobile device management server. So, for instance, in my ABM, I have it directed to my Incentral server. And what that will allow you to do is automatically enroll devices into your remote management tool. Right, the agent will get pushed. All the profile settings, with the exception of a couple, will get pushed, and the ABM tool will manage that enrollment in conjunction with that MDM server. Uh,
So,
this can
so
be
that
done
sounds
in.
a little
Yeah,
bit of a
go ahead.
hybrid approach, right? Where you're using both this ABM or Apple Business Manager and
Mhm.
your own kind of off-the-shelf MDM software, right?
Yeah, and Apple Business Manager really, in at least once you start getting used to getting your devices enrolled into Apple Business Manager, which should happen upon purchase of the devices. We could talk about retroactive in a second. Um, Once you get used to doing that, spinning or turning on the device, getting it enrolled, the real primary function of ABM, at least in my world, is application management, right? Because in the Apple world, um, not only are you looking to update in the same way you install applications a lot of the time, you're also looking at mass rollout of 365, Chrome, or any other software that you can find in that app store, uh, which,
Gotcha.
which
Yeah,
which makes it quite nice.
yeah, and Joe, you covered a lot of kind of features that MDM and Apple Business Manager can kind of support. But I do want to cover this question from William, which I think is a great one. What's the best way to convince a director to allocate a budget for MDM?
Well, so um, I'll William, I'll kind of attack this from two places, and you let me know which is the primary. But kind of coming from an end user side, right? Why should we support an MDM to an MSP? Why should we support an MDM and delegate budget to that? So, starting from the MSP half, Um, we all know the basic reasons, right? CEOs or business owners love to have Mac devices while the rest of the business has Dells or something like that because they're special, right? If there's marketing, Mac is the creative tool. If you're working with a development business, Mac is becoming the primary developer machine, right? It is easier to develop on Mac than it is on Windows. Like looking at you, Ruby on Rails. Um, and I've seen that in my life. My dad's a senior developer at IBM. For the longest time, he was on Lenovo devices, right? As of 3 years ago, he's now primarily on Macs. So we're seeing those common ones change, but more importantly in the MSP space, why I think we need to budget for an MDM is first off, Macs are very heavily growing in the MSP environment. Um, 22.5% of devices in a business setting are now Macs, and that's up almost 5% from 2 years ago, right? So we start to see
Wow.
they're just common. Then, more importantly, I think as we're seeing Gen X and millennials and I don't think alpha's getting into the workforce yet, but the newer generations getting into the workforce, Apple's got the best marketing out there. These generations are primarily Apple users, right? And if we look at predictions down the road where you see in 2030 almost 40% of the workforce is going to be made up by Gen X itself, right? These are the people coming into an organization and saying, I want a Mac, I want an iPhone. This is where I've lived my life. I'm going to be the most effective there. So I kind of bring up those 2 points to say, like, they're just common, right? It's now something we need to be looking at as an MSP. But then on top of it, Mac ransomware and malicious attacks are growing in the 100% range each year, right? With the commoditization, I think is the word, of um, malicious attacks, right? People are realizing, or these bad actors are now realizing that Macs are the big money item, right? I can get a CEO, I can get a business owner, I can get a VP on these Mac devices. Those are the people I want to be shutting down, right? Not that for lack of a better term, disposable $250 Dell. I want to hit this, $2,500 shiny laptop sitting on the
Sure.
C-level desk,
I've
right?
heard Macs don't have viruses, Joe. Is this a misconception?
Well, so I think that's a big misconception, but I also think it's a sign of where we're coming from, right?
Yeah.
So 10 years ago, we look even closer to pre-pandemic time, like 6 to 5 years ago, Mac viruses were very rare. Part of it's because they're built off of Unix OS, right? Darwin. And typically you very rarely see viruses for Linux or Unix because you don't bite the hand that feeds you, right? All of these bad actors are more often than not on Linux devices when they're creating their software, right? But over the pandemic and over these past 6 years, we're now seeing a spread of, I would say, like ransomware or like just malicious software that's no longer really trying to live at the OS level, right? It's going to live in the application or it's going to live, you know, higher up on the devices. So it becomes more prevalent in the Mac world. Um, I'm trying to remember the statistic off the top of my head. Um, it wasn't a large part of the attacks that were committed last year, but it was still in the 15 to 20% could be aimed at a Mac device, right? And that's enough for me to say, okay, I need to be managing these tools. One of the things that I'd keep in mind with the budgeting of MDM is more often than not, if you're an MSP, right? The RMM you use, that MDM cost should be built into the RMM, at least for the competitors that I know pricing wise. And then when you get into Adigy and Jamf, they are a little bit more expensive than, say, Enables products or ConnectWise or Kaseya or the Ninja, right? The common folk in the MSP world, but they are RMM built in with MDM. So that tool is really just your RMM cost. Um, from the end user's perspective, when we look at budgeting for MDM, right, we just bring up that same information, but we bring it up from the end user's perspective, right? I see Mr. or Mrs. Business Owner, you're on a Mac. What happens when your device gets hacked? What am I supposed to do? Right. Um, so I think that kind of gives some ammo to that argument there. I hope, William, that answered that question well enough.
Yeah, I think to me it's clear, but yeah, obviously translating to director level sometimes can be challenging. So, William, let us know if that's helpful, and other folks, if you're joining in, feel free to drop a comment. We'd be happy to kind of cover it.
Yeah.
So cool, Joe. Yeah, we've talked about. Yeah, he says, great answer. Thank you. Glad to hear it. We've talked about kind of ABM and MDM and kind of some of the landscape a little bit. Um, Joe, I think you mentioned earlier on monitoring tools, there's kind of a lack. Can we chat about that?
Yeah, so I think one of the difficulties with Mac devices is if we're in the MSP space, you're in the channel, it almost doesn't matter what vendor you're going to. Again, we can go through the laundry list. Managing Mac devices has always been difficult. And part of it is, as MSPs, for years, we've shied away from Macs because Apple does make certain things more difficult. Um, and running a business, developing RMM software, if there's not revenue, development may take a hit, right? So we get, I don't want to say a lack of feature or lack of monitoring and management. We just get difficult monitoring and management. Mac devices aren't treated the same way as Windows devices are. And you'll see in these MSP oriented RMMs, something's going to give on the Mac side, right? There might not be a remote background tool that natively interacts with the terminal rather than full blown take control. You might not have the ability to automate on a Mac. You might not have the ability to automatically monitor daemons, right? You might be lacking on the backup side, right? You might have issues monitoring things like SIP or device space or disk space or something along those lines. There's always, at least historically, has always been a bit of a lacking feature set compared to what you see in Jamf and Adigy, which are, again, those big hitters in the Mac world for monitoring and management, right? Where they have automation, remote background, take control, backup, third party security, of course. But they also bring things to the table like a GUI interface to create profiles, right? They bring a GUI interface to create scripts inside the tool. Um, so in the MSP world, there's always been a little bit of a lack. Now we're responding to it, right? As an industry, you'll see some of Enable's competitors have been picking up on their Mac management. Enable has as well, right? Over the past year, we brought MDM into our tool. We brought a much richer feature set, but we're still not where we are with Windows, right? So there's always been a little bit of a lack for Mac folk, and what that means is we've got to find out ways to get around it. Patch management being one, right? Do you want to manage your own monkey database? Probably not,
Sure. Yeah, there's
right?
always a way.
Um,
Good cover. Good coverage there. I do want to context switch for another minute because we got
yeah.
another question. I think this is from Matthew. What are some good resources for beginners to get into Apple management? Coming from someone who's been in the Windows environment their entire professional career.
Um,
I think being
so
here is one of them, right?
right, yeah, of course,
It's a
being
start.
here, right? I'll admit, so I became head nerd May of 2022. Um, and November of 2022, Mark Andre, my manager, showed up with a Mac, put it on my desk, and goes, "You're now the Mac nerd." The last Apple I had before that was an Apple II, right? We're talking 5.5-inch floppy Oregon Trail. Um,
Oh yeah.
so I understand the pain here. Um, I would say the best way to learn about how to manage an Apple device is first off have one, right? Use a Mac for a quarter or 6 months. Get used to sitting with the tool. Apple has some very good training programs. There are two through Apple themselves. One is specifically monitoring and management of Apple devices. The other is tech support for Apple devices, and that's iOS, Mac OS, all of the OS flavors that they have that were both very good. They are pay to play. You do get certified after them. When I took the tests, it was 250 bucks, I believe. So not too reasonably expensive. Um, LinkedIn Learning, weirdly enough, has a lot of Apple management resources that are very good. I did some learning there specifically about how to navigate through a Mac OS, how to interact in a tech support fashion with a Mac OS. It's also very good for keeping up with the updates to Mac, so you can have the features quickly and easily able to be learned. And then to toot my own horn, inside Enable, if you guys go to me.n-able.com, you'll see an events page where you'll find the Whole Head Nerd Team. I run a series about once every 6 months or so that starts off with managing Macs for the Windows admin, parts 1 and 2. And we'll go through basics of a Mac. How is it set up? How is the disk laid out? What are all of the acronyms you need to know? And how do you work with them? Right? What does SIP do for you? Why does it sometimes hurt you? And then there's a automation session after that where we'll go through beginner, intermediate, and advanced. I believe that one's three: beginner, intermediate, and advanced automation on Mac devices as well. Um, and there you'll probably have uh uh what I think 7 to 8 hours of Mac learning from me, right? You look at the Apple programs, there's another like 12, um 12 to 15. You look at all the LinkedIn learning stuff, I mean, you could just sit there for months as well. So those are the resources that I used. um Outside of that, learning to automate on a Mac, especially when it comes to installation of apps, I got a lot of learning done. And whether you want to use a tool called Homebrew or Installamator, either one of those are good for learning. They function like Chocolatey does for Windows devices, and going through and automating the installation of apps or using those tools to update your applications and remove applications was some pretty good hands-on learning for me as well, at least in the basics of automation.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for covering that. Got a lot of great feedback from both William and I think it was Matthew who asked the question there. So I dropped a link as well. I believe that was me.enable.com or
Hmm.
in-able. So folks can check that out for some more resources. Kind of curious, Joe, we were talking about automation a little bit before the call specifically and some challenges around cron and different things. Perhaps you could guide us through just a really basic workflow for what that might look like. You of course mentioned I think Brew, which is a tool I've used before, but could we go deeper?
Yeah, so when we talk about automation for a Mac, there's a couple things we have to be aware of, um, what we're looking at doing to the Macs. First off, Mac does tend to be very user controlled. So, for instance, updating Mac OS through MDM, which we consider to be automation. Um, uh, you're going to interact with the end user more often than not, either forcing them to agree to the update or sending some type of restart command, or even just getting permission to do anything through updates with the end users. Um, the the other stumbling block a lot of times I found inside Mac devices that you're bringing on to underneath your management is silent installs are very difficult to script. That's where we brought up, creating a cron job through Launch D is just a pain in the butt on a Mac device. So doing something like installing your agent can be very difficult on the Mac devices in some type of automated fashion because again, it's going to require that end user control, right? Enrolling automatically with push certificates, right? End user interaction, or at least the Apple ID interaction that controls that push cert. But writing the scripts themselves is actually, I don't want to say fairly easy on a Mac, but very flexible on a Mac. So one of the things that Apple's done that I find to be quite nice is uh, Shell, whichever variation you're using, will run on a Mac. So if you want to start with Bourne Again Shell or Bash, which is the most commonly used scripting language on the Mac, right? We've all heard of it. Even though that has been retired by Z Shell, right? It's still supported. You just put a different shebang in front of the script. So it gives a little bit of flexibility with wherever you're coming from in your Mac experience. It typically will accept the automation that you currently have. Um, the other nice bit of it is inside the terminal itself, Mac has built in some very easy ways to start creating scripts themselves for you, right? Where if you can run that set of actions in the terminal, you can enter Nano, right, and it'll pull in previous actions taken, and you can save it directly as a shell script. So there are some ways that we look at making scripting easier on Macs, but there's some that tend to be more difficult. But if you were to look at a workflow for me creating a script, I tend to do everything I want inside the terminal to test all of the commands I'm going to be running, make sure I'm getting the right outputs and information back, combine it all into one big line in the terminal. And then once I have that line, I'll just switch over to Nano and save that set of actions as a script wherever I would like on that device. So that tends to be pretty easy. Um, uh, but more so when it comes to automation, I guess I'll say to kind of wrap it up, the real thing is Apple is as Apple does, and I've said that a couple times, right? Apple limits what you can and cannot do very heavily to their devices, and Windows is moving in that direction, but Apple does tend to be a little bit more strict. So the hardest thing I think I have inside scripting, if I'm not running through an RMM itself, passwords, usernames, IP addresses, any type of sensitive information, because you're running in a bash script, can be pulled off those devices. So I am pretty careful of what we're doing scripting because I don't want to have the sudo command in there and me enter my password. Right. So you've also got to be careful, where you're running, what level you're running your scripts at too. Uh, which again, I think
Yeah.
is kind of built in by Apple itself, but something us as MSPs haven't really thought about because on the Windows side of the house, we can run as admin very easily.
Yeah, I imagine running as, sudo or root on an Apple device is perhaps frowned upon. Is that
Yeah, but
accurate?
nicely your RMM should be installed at that admin level, so you should be able to run automation through the RMM as root.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for covering some of that. And that's what I've really enjoyed about using a Mac as well as this. kind of ability to use bash scripting, something you could have on a Linux box against your own machine, and for the most part things work. Sometimes I've found some weirdness between certain Unix utilities, but
Yeah, if you know Linux as an MSP, um, I would say 85 to 90% of what you do automation wise through scripting on a Linux box transfers over to Mac. It's not 100%, right?
for sure. Yeah.
Hence my problem with cron jobs, but you know, it is very easily translatable.
Yeah. One question from William, interesting one. Might be the wrong place to ask, but any recommendations on a MacBook Pro that I could open up and upgrade? It seems like a lot are hardware locked.
Yeah, so if you want to open up a MacBook to update it, uh, two things are going to happen. First off, you'll have to take that tech support certification from Apple, and I believe move up one level from that. I think there's a hardware certification. And then the second thing you'll have to do is drop a hefty chunk of change on the Apple tech desk, which nicely comes packed in this huge Pelican case from Apple themselves. I think it's like, you know, 15 to 75K, depending on how much you want to spend on it.
Oh,
Um, and you can upgrade through Apple. You're pretty much becoming an Apple support person at that point in time. But it's not recommended, at least in the beginning of working with a Mac, to try and pop one open and replace hardware and that kind of deal, because it is going to be hardware locked, and that is Apple's intention there.
for
Um,
sure. And I'd be curious if Hackintosh is still a thing. You might
so
look that up, William. It's basically, as I understand it, kind of a project to run Mac OS on any hardware you want. Of course,
yep,
this is probably not at all okay for business environment, but for kind of getting familiar with the system, I know some folks that have had good success with that when Macs are expensive, so that could be a good choice, or even a used system from not sponsored, but I enjoy swappa.com. Is a pretty great site. They have some older models.
yeah,
William
and
says awesome.
Hackintosh is still a thing. Um, but do keep in mind, Hackintosh will be for learning how to deal with a Mac. It won't be for learning how to manage a Mac. Um,
Yeah, you probably can't manage those in your MDM. There's probably some sort of key
no,
or
Apple
something.
Apple will Apple will
Yeah,
figure that one out. I don't think there's an
yeah,
MDM out there that likes either a VM or a Hackintosh VM or a Hackintosh physical device. So
sure.
do be
That's like
aware of that.
it's like trying to play Call of Duty on your hacked Xbox online, getting
Right.
booted.
Somebody's
Similar.
gonna find you.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for the questions, William. What else, Joe? We we've got some bullet points, and we've burned through some of them. That I've really enjoyed talking about. So we chatted about MDM, ABM, and kind of some of the monitoring tool landscape and how that's getting better. And then this next item, no, we did talk about automation as well. Did we talk about updates and patches? What does that look like
Not
in the
yet.
Apple system?
So
Can
we
you
actually
give us the
Rachel
lowdown?
just came in where we have
Oh
a
yeah,
huge issue with updates in our
let's hit
organization.
this.
Um, any suggestions? People don't like being down for an hour without their computer and need an admin to complete it. Um, so when we're talking about updates here, my assumption is we're looking at the Mac OS updates or the Apple updates, the the big ones. Um, what I would suggest there is look into what your MDM can do, or the MDM that you're looking at using can do, because there is more than likely a way that you can control that in a better fashion, right? So when we look at the ones I have experience with, again, Adigy, Jamf enables in Central or Insight, when I'm going to push a Mac OS update or an Apple update, I have the flexibility to download it only, and then at a time of my choosing outside of office hours or that kind of deal, I can go ahead and force that update. You have the ability to pull and install immediately, but not force any type of reboot. You'll have the ability through MDM to give the end user a little bit more interaction with a download and install later, where the end user is choosing when to install it later. And MDM will force them to choose a time to install it. There's no declining once you've sent that command. Um, you'll have typically in an MDM the ability to install and force a restart, right? Again, very heavy handed, probably outside of office hours or for the end user that just never updates. You do have that functionality. And then you'll also have the functionality coming from uh, uh, the MDM to, uh, excuse me, to notify the user that the update is there and then wait for them to go in and select to download and update on their own. Right? If we've ever been on a Mac device, you'll see that red exclamation point over the settings symbol, and that'll be a nice reminder. Um, but there's definitely through MDM a number of ways that you can look at doing this, where end users aren't being inconvenienced unless you're forcing them to do it because they've been ignoring you. Um, but MDM, I think, would be the way to go there. And I hope that answers that question.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, Rachel, for chiming in. Folks, don't forget, we'll be fielding questions here if you want to drop them in the comments. Couple other things, Joe. One area we didn't cover is backup. Is that something that's built into some of these NVM tools, or does Apple have a solution for that? What
Well,
are you seeing?
yeah, so Apple always has Time Vault, right? Where we can use the built-in tools for Apple, and the items that are coming directly from them. But it's not quite my preferred method, right? It's kind of like, do we let Windows back up only with the VSS writers and shadow copy, right? No, you're going to need to have another level of backup on there. Now, there is some nice functionality built into the Apple space itself, right? With storage in the iCloud or applications attached to users, right? The Apple IDs, or information attached to the Apple IDs. So Apple is a little bit more flexible than Windows in that world, just because of the fact that they've had to build it so that everything can be interconnected, right? If I set up a Netflix account on my MacBook, right? I want to be able to access it on my iPhone. I want to be able to access it on my Apple TV. And that kind of sharing is quite nice, but I don't think it quite covers backup. So I would always recommend looking at a tool that is going to support Mac file and folder backup, right? And specifically file and folder. There's no such thing as a bare metal recovery on a Mac device. And anybody who tells you that they can perform bare metal recovery on a Mac is either using Apple to do it as well, right? Because Apple's going to control the loading of the OS, or they're just straight up, lying about what their tool can do. Um, we can talk about that in a second, as to what a bare metal recovery would look like, because there are some ways to get around it. But you look at the leading backups in the market, they're still only pulling file and folders because that bare metal recovery is going to be performed by Apple itself. But again, we want something we can manage as MSPs. We can't manage the iCloud. We can't manage Time Vault that well. So we want something like Cove or Veeam or Datto or any of these other backup tools out there, where we can have a cloud redundancy of file and folders, where we can have our own physical redundancy of files and folders that we manage, right? We have, you know, possibly a recovery location where our end users can pull files from if they need for self-service. You want to have that functionality built in. But kind of to quickly get back in, bare metal recovery on a Mac, again, it's something that cannot be done by a backup tool. Nobody can. There are some ways we can get around this though. So if you're willing to void a warranty on a Mac device, and huge disclaimer, it is warding voiding your warranty. You can take a Mac OS on a USB stick, make sure that that Mac never touches the internet when it's loading up, possibly by disabling the NIC card, and perform a bare metal recovery that way off of the USB stick. But that's the only way I found to do it. And again, we lose Apple Business Manager. You lose, you know, the Apple Store support. As good or bad as your local Apple Store is, it's still valuable for support, right? You lose the ability to go to a lot of places and play around with easier management of a Mac once you do that yourself.
Yeah,
Um,
fantastic. We did get a comment from Sec Override here. Managed Apple IDs from Docs, Find My Backups, etc. not available. Is there another solution as backups and device tracking are desired?
so if we're looking for backup solutions, I'm partial to Cove, one because of Enable, but outside of Enable, I'm partial to Cove because it is a cloud first backup, um, and it runs off of only incremental changes on files and folders, so I can much more quickly back up my devices. So when I was an MSP using Cove, my backup schedule on my SQL servers, to kind of plug Cove here, was every hour and a half to 3 hours. And then on my Mac devices and my Windows workstations, laptops or desktops, I was running backup almost every hour, with little to no resource drain seen by the end users. Um, uh, so I do like that for the Mac OS items. For iOS items, I tended to focus as an MSP in using the iCloud. Primarily because there's nothing really on an iOS device, either iPad or um, iPhone, that should be mission critical and damaging there, right? Plus, it's also very much easier, or very much simpler to set up those iOS or iPad OS devices to quickly back up to the iCloud, with minimal cost, right? Backing up a Mac to the iCloud can get very expensive because storage, but the iOS devices, I tended to use the iCloud. Because, like, what am I really pulling off of an iOS device, right? iPhones, it's contacts, maybe a couple files and folders like pictures, um, but all of the applications, all of the settings, all of that stuff that I've got on that iPhone, I can pull from my Apple ID and the Apple Store, right?
Yeah,
iPad
kind of,
OS maybe being a little more sensitive.
yeah, much more kind of ephemeral, I guess, than a desktop device or a
Mhm.
laptop, so to speak. Um, I had
But
a question, Joe, that we touched just a little bit on earlier, but there was kind of this ability to provision devices when they're purchased. Can you speak to that a little bit?
yeah, so what'll happen with ABM is, and bear with me. Uh, uh, so what happens when you purchase a device through Apple? You'll give it, or your end user purchases the device from Apple. They'll enroll it into Apple Business Manager for you, right? Where they'll just pump the serial number of the device into Apple Business Manager. Once that device turns on, you'll get the hello, hola, ni hao, all of the different languages saying hello screen. And once you connect that device to Wi Fi, which should be the third step after you pick language and country, um, that device will immediately go and see if it's registered with ABM. And if it is registered with ABM, what the device will then do, if we're using a well built mobile device management tool, is it will put a stopgap in the loading of that OS upon initial load of the device, and it won't allow the end user to go forward without confirming that that device is going to be managed by that MDM tool, and it'll automatically load your agent and any profiles that you've had. For devices that are already live, you can manually enroll them in ABM, and you'll have one of two options for registering that device inside your MDM server at that point. The old school and most tried and true method of that is to make sure the device is backed up. You have access to the backup, remote wipe the device, and then turn back on. And that will automatically, it'll work like it's a brand new device at that point. You can also reset MDM servers on the devices themselves, but that is something that is reasonably difficult to automate. It's also something that's a little bit difficult to do manually, so probably not something I would have beginners looking at delving into. But once you get comfortable with Mac devices, that's definitely something you could look at doing as well.
Fantastic. And just a quick follow-up from Sec Override on our backup discussion. They say, okay, cool. When looking at the manage IDs, it states iCloud backup isn't available. Have I misunderstood something? Not sure if you've seen that before.
Um, so for managed Apple IDs, um, you can work with these in two different fashions, right? Um, what I tend to do, at least managing devices, is my um, my Apple ID for my client. So, Joe at client A.com, Joe at client B.com, Joe at client C.com. Those will be those managed Apple IDs. They will be the ones that control my device's push certs, as well as enrollment and sync with anything like Entra ID or ABM or anything along those lines. And we're correct. I don't believe you have access to the iCloud there, but my end users themselves, I'll have them use a semi-personal Apple ID to log into their devices with, of course, very heavily managed permissions behind that personal ID, so that they do have access to photos and messages and other iCloud data just like they would in a personal Mac. Now, I'm not going to give, Jason at gmail.com access to the Mac, of course, right? It is still going to be a company domain. It's going to be a company managed user, but that's how I tend to attack that problem. Um, I hope that that kind of answers that question by saying, yeah, you're correct, but it's also there's some ways to get around it there. Sec override.
Great. Yeah, one more question here from, I think it's Avner Koopman. What are the best or recommended RMM platforms that have a good Mac MDM? I'm currently using Synchro.
So I'll plug enable for it. Um, because one, our Mac management has been very, very quickly growing over the past year, um, or at least since I've been working with it as a nerd as well, so probably a year and a half, where we have an automated patch script built into the software that can be reported on. We have all of your base MDM. We have take control. We have remote background. We have automation on Macs. You have the ability to assign templates. We've got some very good feature and functionality there, especially in the beginner world of managing Macs. Now, that being said, right, we are not Adigy nor are we Jamf, right? We've been around managing Macs with device management for Apple for 2 years, right? 3 years. You look at Adigy or Jamf, 25 and 30 years respectively, they are just the baselines in the game, right? So when you're looking for the best Mac management, I would have to say Adigy or Jamf. The kink in the chain with those, however, is they are very expensive. Um, Jamf, when I was running my MSP, was I was unable to maintain a reasonable margin on my devices, where I was aiming for anywhere from 55 to 65% on at least the RMM side of my devices for margin. I could not maintain that for my Mac devices using Jamf. It is more expensive. Uh, that being said, it is a wicked good tool. Adigy is a little bit less expensive, but it's still more expensive than your Enables, your Synchro MSPs, your Datos, ConnectWise, all of them. But it is still a very, very good tool as well. Um, when working with Enable partners on the Mac side of the house, when I talk to what I would call an operationally mature Mac MSP, they are almost across the board using Adigy at this point in time, right?
Awesome. Yeah, I think we're kind of running out of questions here, but Joe, we've only just scratched the surface on some of this stuff. Really, kind of covered a lot, very broad and general on just some of the solutions out there and what the processes might look like. We mentioned earlier in the call where folks can find some resources, but maybe
Mhm.
it'd be good to plug that again. If folks want to learn more about managing Mac devices, where can they go?
Yeah, so again, you've got the two Apple courses, the Apple the Apple device management course and the Apple device support course. Both of those are very good. You have a number of resources inside LinkedIn Learning that I've used uh, that are exceptional. And then I would also hit me.enable.com um, and go to our events page, and you can find me running boot camps, two in a series as Mac management for the Windows admin, and then we'll also have some Mac automation items there as well. And it is going to be N-central or Insight geared, right? But the vast majority of all of those sessions are Apple specific, not Insight or N-central specific. Like if you attend the automation classes or boot camps, you walk away with practical items that you can use in your life, right? They're not specific to Insight or N-central. You'll just have to, ignore the implementation if you're not on Insight or N-central.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
of the courses, I really only spent probably 45 minutes total inside our tools. The vast majority of it is here's how Apple works.
Cool, good deal. And Joe, if you don't mind, I'm going to drop your email here
Yeah, by all means.
as well. So if folks have other questions and want to learn more about Mac management, you're kind of the guy for it. We had you on last month for a session like this. I think I don't even remember what we talked about, to be
That
honest.
one was
Was it
why the clouds are
security?
difficult to manage.
Cloud, yes, the clouds are very difficult to kind of harness and manage. But for folks that are new here, haven't been to one of these live streams, we do these about once a month or so with Enable folks over there, and really, really quite informative. And of course, we're happy to feature comments. So please watch out for more of these. We'll send out a recording, and I hope you all have a great afternoon. All right, see you, Joe.
All right, we'll see
Bye.
you guys later. Bye.